chapter of the book of Naomi, and I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to prove it to you, this chapter. We've already seen let's see, how far have we gotten? E-D-R-A, but we haven't seen the N yet, so that's coming. Chapter 4, I have titled Naomi's Son and God's Provision. Now you may think to yourself, I thought Ruth was the one that had the son. Well, she is, but the people say, oh look, it's a son for Naomi. Just another reason she's the main character in the story. Okay, so let's start with verse 1. We're going to read verses 1 through 6. So, again, just a little reminder. Ruth went to the threshing floor in the middle of the night, spoke with Boaz, and he told her, I will do for you what you're asking of me. I would like to redeem you. I'm going to go to the city, and I'm going to make the arrangements. So that's where we're at. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. He then took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here, and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up to the name of the deceased his inheritance. The closest relative said, oh, I cannot redeem it for myself, because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. Okay, so we got a lot of redeeming going on. We're going to explain what that means here. And as you can see, Boaz went to the gate, because the gate was where they did business. Let's say they had a complaint against someone, or someone had stolen something, or what have you, or they were purchasing land, something like that. They would always do it at the gate. That was where the elders of the city would meet, and so that's why it says he went up to the gate and he sat down there. So this redeemer language, in Hebrew, the word is goel. That's how we would pronounce it. And in Hebrew, okay, you know how we put S's or ES's on the end of words to say that they're plural, like the boxes or my shoes or things like that. So in Hebrew, they do that by adding an I and an M. So the word for redeemer, a singular redeemer, is goel, and the plural would be goelim. That's how they pronounce it. So we can see that there are several goelim. There are several redeemers, but there's only one goel. There's only one final redeemer, but there are several people that could fill that slot. So we have that hierarchy again. We're talking about the closest relative. Whoever was the closest relative, that person would be given the opportunity to redeem. Okay, so let's talk about the different ways this person would be the redeemer. Let's say, okay, so we know I have one sister. Her name is Trina. Let's say I go into debt. Maybe I own property, but I go into a lot of debt and I have to lose my property. My sister, she is my closest relative. She can redeem my property for me. Okay, let's say I become even poorer and I have to sell myself into slavery. Hopefully this never happens, but in case I do, and it did happen during those days, they would sell themselves as indentured slaves in order to pay back a debt. So my sister could come from, her home in Nevada, and she could come and buy me back. And so she could redeem me in that way. Another thing is, let's say someone murdered me. I don't like the idea, but let's just give it as an example. My sister then would track them down and judge them. She would kill them in judgment for killing me, murdering me. Before the time of the kings, they didn't have rules like that, or at least the people weren't very concerned about following those rules. So God put it in the place of the closest relative to bring judgment on someone who was a murderer. So my sister would come from Nevada. She would hunt you down if you had murdered me, and she would find you. And so that was another role of the redeemer. Now this part gets a little confusing, so follow me here. There's the role of the redeemer, which has to do with property or slavery or judgment. And then there's this other thing that sort of comes into play, and it's called the levirate marriage. Okay, so this was an idea that God suggested in order to provide for widows. And what happened was, if, say, I was married, I am not, but let's say that I am, and my husband dies, then his brother would marry me and provide for me and raise up a child for his dead brother. Okay, so this was the levirate marriage. Now, the levirate marriage and the redeemer language in the law don't necessarily go together. But Naomi is hoping that it will in Boaz's mind, and it ends up doing so. So if we think back about that idea that Boaz always goes beyond what's expected, okay, what's expected in this circumstance is that this gentleman will buy back the land. But Boaz, if you notice, first of all, he says, oh, Naomi has this land she has up for sale. And the guy's like, yes, I'll redeem it. Let's do this, you know? And then he's like, by the way, there's a Moabitess that goes with it. And the guy's like, oh, wait a minute. Let's rethink this. So this is Boaz, again, going beyond what's expected and going above and beyond the call of duty in order to provide. So Naomi had to sell her land because of her poverty, and Boaz, he's got this strategy. He's going to bring it up, the land, and then he's going to remind him, oh, you've got this woman that you've got to marry too. The guy is not too keen on marrying Ruth. We don't know why. He doesn't say what he means by this. He says that it would jeopardize his own inheritance. So he's afraid somehow that this is going to ruin something for his family. So he could mean that maybe he wasn't wealthy enough for both a field, because he's going to buy this field, and now he has to support a new wife. Maybe he can't afford both, and it would jeopardize, he would have to go into debt to do it. Or maybe he's afraid that what happened to Elimelech will happen to him, because he would be marrying a Moabite woman, which God said, you know, I want you to marry Israelite women because they'll help encourage you to worship me. So maybe he was concerned about what happened to Elimelech, or he might have been concerned that if he had a child by another woman, that it would jeopardize the inheritance of his children with his current wife. So whatever the reason, I think it is fascinating that this man who is so concerned about preserving his own inheritance, we don't even know the man's name in the story. I mean, if you notice, it says the close relative, and then Boaz says to him, friend, sit down here. And the word friend there actually means, okay, believe it or not, in the Hebrew they have Mr. So-and-so, like we do in English. Or could you pick up such and such and do so-and-so with it? And they have those kinds of concepts in the Hebrew language, and that's pretty much what he called him here, Mr. So-and-so. The guy doesn't even get a name in the book. And he was the one that was concerned about preserving his inheritance. And yet Boaz, the man who provides for others and goes beyond, he's the one that becomes famous. So we can see that God honors those who put their interests aside and provide for others, or work for others, like Ruth did. So this guy, he only gets a Mr. So-and-so. That's all we know him by in the story. And he does what is expected. You know, it will cost him something, so he stops and pulls back and says, no, never mind, I can't do it. That's what's expected. But Boaz, he goes far beyond that. Verses 7 through 12. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal, believe it or not, and gave it to another. And this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative, again, the man doesn't get a name, Mr. So-and-so said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. All the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrath and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. So this was the way that they, determined land was passing from one to another. They took off their shoe and handed it to the guy who was buying it. Seems like a strange practice to us. And actually, the way the narrator says it, he says that it's actually passed out of vogue by his time. He says in verse 7, now this was the custom in former times. So our narrator is living at a later time, and he's saying, look, this is crazy, okay, but this is what they used to do. They would take off their sandal, and they would hand it to the guy who bought the land. So he has done what Ruth has asked him to do. And the elders and the witnesses, they're saying, wow, this is great. This is great. I hope this woman comes into your house and she provides so many children for you that your name becomes famous and that she blesses your household. And they don't know, but what they're saying will come to pass. They think they're just blessing him because he's being kind, right? He's taking care of a foreigner and of Naomi. But what they don't know is that they are speaking truth. And what they are saying, it will happen. He will become famous. And for reasons that they don't understand. And even it will pass their lifetime. It will go far beyond them into the future. And there again is that surprise of what they think is going to happen and then what we learn at the end. That's even bigger. That's my favorite part. Okay, that's the third time I've said that, but it really will be my favorite part, I swear. Okay, so verses 13 through 22. So Boaz has done what he said he would do. He has redeemed Ruth. Does everybody understand the redeeming part? I know it's a little murky, but because he was a close relative, he could buy Naomi's land, and with it came Ruth. And so he was planning on raising up a child for her dead husband's name. Okay, so that's where we're going with that. Verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her. And the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Amminadab. And to Amminadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz. There's a name we recognize. And to Boaz, Obed. And to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse, David. So this genealogy closes our book that our narrator has written for us. We're going to talk about why that's such a big deal, but let's start back where Ruth becomes pregnant. Okay, in the second half there of verse 13, it says, and the Lord enabled her to conceive. This is the second time in the entire book, 85 verses, that God is the subject of a verb. Really, although they've used a lot of blessings and prayer to God, he hasn't actually been acting. Remember that verse where it said, and she just happened upon the field of Boaz. It didn't even mention him there, even though he was at work. So this is the second time that is mentioned him as an actor. And the first one, if you remember, was in chapter 1, where God visited his people and gave them food. Okay, so remember our two themes. We have famine and we have death. God has overturned both of those themes by the end of the book. So the narrator is saying, okay, we have these two problems, and I just want you to notice that God solves all of them. Every single last one, and it's not troublesome for him. He just makes it happen. So first of all, there was famine. He provided food. Secondly, there was barrenness or death, and now he provides a new life. And our narrator wants to point that out, and he does so with themes and special words, and it's a really great, that's why everyone says it's such a great short story, because he repeats those themes and goes back to them and reminds us what God is doing. Now, there are other biblical stories. Now, she was barren, remember? She lived with her husband, Mahlon, I think. That was her husband's name. We finally hear which of the sons was her husband. His name was Mahlon. She lived with him for about 10 years, and she never had a child. So she had been barren. And if we think back into the Old Testament, some other stories of women that were barren that God visited in order so that they could give birth. Their children were always very prominent in the history of Israel. So one, we already mentioned Sarah. Sarah could not get pregnant. She was actually beyond childbearing age, but yet God gave her Isaac, and he was the child of promise, as we mentioned. Rachel, if you remember, Jacob married Rachel and Leah, two sisters. Leah kept having children, boys especially, which were highly valued in that society, and Rachel couldn't have any children, and she was devastated. Her first son was Joseph. Okay, she had Joseph and Benjamin, if you remember. And Joseph, he was the one that saved the entire clan of Jacob, because they were living in the land of Israel, and then there was a famine, again, another famine. And if you remember, Joseph's brothers didn't like him very much, so they sold him into slavery. Not the best way to travel to Egypt, but that was his way. God brought him to Egypt, he blessed him, and before you knew it, Joseph was over the entire land. He was like second to the Pharaoh who was in charge. And because of Joseph, he provided for his entire family. Jacob and all of his sons, they didn't recognize him at first, but they learned about it later. They all came to the land of Egypt, and Joseph provided food and a place for their livestock for all of them. I mean, he saved all of their lives. And this was the son that was born after God visited Rachel, his mother. So he was of great importance in the history of Israel. He was very famous. Samson's mom, if you remember, she was also barren. And Samson, although he had a checkered history, he was a deliverer of God's people in the time of the Judges, which is around the same time that our story is written. And then Hannah, after our story, she has Samuel. Even though she was barren, God gave her a child. So we see that when it looks like something is impossible, barrenness, God says, not only can I fix that, but I'm going to use that to be a blessing to the nation and to the people of God. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now these women, these are probably the same women that said, is that Naomi? They were shocked when they saw her come to the city. Now they're rejoicing with her because she has a family again. She has people to take care of her, people that want her around, that she can look after and can look after her. So they are happy for her. And they say, blessed is the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer. So they see, it's clear, the Lord is the one that has provided for Naomi in giving her Ruth, and then in giving her Boaz, and now Obed, who is Ruth's son. And the boy, they say that this boy, he's going to take care of you, he is just going to adore you, and he's going to sustain you in your old age. And that was something, I mean, think about Naomi's journey. Remember when she told her daughters-in-law, go back. I have nothing. I can't give you anything. I mean, even if I had time to have a child, it couldn't grow up for you to marry. And I'm sure she never dreamed in a million years that she would be holding this baby in her lap and she would get to take care of him. And what an answer to a prayer that honestly she wasn't even able to pray because she was just surrounded by despair. She didn't see hope. But the Lord, that didn't stop him. A little bit of doubt, it's not going to slow God down. He's going to provide. And then we get to watch him do that, and we get to praise him when he does. A remarkable statement in the women's sort of their blessing is verse 15. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Again, looking back, when she arrived in Israel with her daughter-in-law, who was a Moabite, who would have guessed that this woman that honestly might have reminded her of the past, might have been sort of a, oh, great, now I've got to be, every time I see Ruth, I'm going to be reminded that I no longer have a son, that I no longer have a husband. That person who reminded her of her struggle, of her past, was the very person that gave her joy. And the Lord often works that way, too, in surprising ways with people and circumstance. And this woman who, wouldn't have been welcomed in the land of Israel is now providing someone who's going to be a major player in Israel's history. So let's think about our Edran. We've talked as we went along, the attempt to repair, they settled in and they tried to take care of one another. We had our equilibrium. Let's think about what that was. It was the beginning when Elimelech and everyone was still alive and they were taking care of one another in the land of Israel before they moved to Moab. Okay, so if we think about it, Naomi was in the equilibrium. Okay, she was a part of the beginning of the story. Pretty much everyone else died except her in that story. So she's the main character in the equilibrium. She's the main character in the disruption. She's the one that loses her loved ones. She's the one that recognizes that and explains how she sees it when she tells those 4 things about God, that he has afflicted me, all of those. We've mentioned those several times, and she changes her name. She attempts to repair by coming back and settling in and living with Ruth. And our new equilibrium. I mean, does this sound anything like what the equilibrium sounded like? So we've got our equilibrium here, all these things in between, our disruption, and then our new equilibrium here. Once again, she's in a family. Once again, she's provided for. Once again, she is loved and she is loving others. So I'm going to argue that this should be called the Book of Naomi, because if you use this narrative analysis, it brings out all those details, that the story is about Naomi's loss. It's about the Lord providing for her and her coming to that realization, and then her praising him in the end. She understands that what she thought was his affliction was really death. It was a negative thing that happened to her, a devastating thing. But the Lord can work with all of that. So I think that the story is about Naomi, because she's the major player in all the situations. And although Ruth is amazing, I will admit, her character is unbelievable. She really is a wonderful person, but I still think it's about Naomi. So I thought maybe we could take a vote here, and I could see how many people I've convinced. Now, if you still want to call it, I say we don't mark it out in our Bible. I say we leave it as it is in our Bible. That would just be awkward, wouldn't it? Your pastor would be up there, and he'd be like, let's turn to the Book of Ruth. And you're like, excuse me, that's Naomi. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're not going to do that, but I did want to take a vote. I just want to see if I've convinced you that this is Naomi's story. Ruth is very important, and she is someone that we should emulate. But I think this story is about Naomi. So let's see. Let's take a vote. Who thinks the story should still be called the Book of Ruth? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, we've got a few. Okay. Oh, wait, this is Ruth, though. This is Ruth. We're voting for Ruth. Okay. Okay. So we have a couple that are still firm on the fact that it should be the Book of Ruth. Okay, what about, who wants to vote for the name change? The Book of Naomi. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. And I think it's obvious, and to be honest, I actually, some of you know of or know Dr. Creamer. I was actually working with a group of students that was studying this book. And he said, you know, gosh, I have a feeling that this story might be about Naomi. And I'm like, oh, please. I mean, Ruth is amazing. Have you read about her recently? I mean, did you hear her speech? And he's like, well, I know. But I'm like, well, I'm not going to believe that until I see it. And then I have to admit, I was convinced. And I realized that it's, you know, it's not in any way putting down Ruth's faithfulness. But the fact is, the story, as it develops, is all about Naomi. And when you get to the end, you realize the message comes from a different angle when you think of it from Naomi's point of view. And that's what we're going to do. But before we do that, we're going to see the ending here. So whose idea was it to throw in this genealogy? I mean, we just had a really great love story, right? And then at the end, so-and-so came from so-and-so, came from so-and-so. I mean, what's the business here? And what this tells us is that our narrator is actually alive during the time of David. And as you know, David was the pinnacle of the kings for the nation of Israel. He was the second king, and God said he was a man after God's own heart, okay? So the person, the narrator, that wrote this story down for us was alive during the time of David, or perhaps afterwards, you know, enough to see them both in history. And he sees the importance of telling us how this family line came about. And I mean, this story is amazing. The fact that a Moabitess came all the way from her country and ended up being in the line of David. I mean, how likely is that? It's not. It's not likely. So his point is to say, these are the people, these are the kind of people These are the faithful people that God brought his king to power through. And, but the most exciting part, okay, this is my favorite part, is that there was something even our narrator didn't know. Now, when I say that, I know that the Bible was written by God. Obviously, he knows everything. But he was the only one that knew this extra detail. And our narrator, he was just writing down history, right, as he knew it and the details. But what he didn't know was this wasn't the only king that was going to come through this line. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 1, and we're going to see some of these familiar names again. We're going to start with verse 1, another genealogy, believe it or not, the record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Okay, so verse 2 starts with Abraham and sort of walks us through all the people in the line. Then we get down to verse 6, and it says David. Okay, David was the father of Solomon. So we've gotten to David now in history. Then we're going to keep moving on through verse 8, 9, 10. We've got a deportation in verse 12 where they get sent to Babylon. They come back, and then around 16, verse 16, we have Jacob, who was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who was called the Messiah. So, if we think of it from our perspective, what's our perspective? It is that Naomi had a devastating circumstance in her life that she thought would never change. And yet, God had something bigger in mind, which, I mean, frankly, he always does. He always has something bigger and better than we could ever imagine for us. And that was the thing. It wasn't that he just used Naomi in order to get his plan accomplished. He incorporated her sorrow and her grief into the most glorious story of mankind, which is the Messiah. I mean, I'm sure if you had gone up to her and said, "So Naomi, sit down, let's talk. Did you know that you're going to be in the line of the Messiah?" She would have gone, "That's sweet, but really, I doubt it," you know? And even they knew that a judge or a leader greater than Moses was going to come. Now, they didn't quite know all the details yet. The prophets hadn't come to tell them some of the things that were going to happen. But the fact was, Naomi never would have believed that she would have been in the line of the Messiah. I mean, this Messiah was half God, half man. I mean, there's no way that she ever would have believed you had you told her that. And God honored this widow that almost gave up on him in spite of the fact that she doubted. Her grief made her doubt, and then she noticed that he was working for her, but what she never knew was that he had seen so far in advance, and he honored her so greatly that he put her family in the line of the Messiah. But those are just the kinds of things that our God does. He sees so much further than we can, and his plans are so much bigger than ours are, and he can work with anything. He can work with sin, he can work with death, he can work with heartache. Nothing can stop him. And if we trust him, he can give us joy far beyond what we could ever ask or think, or even pray for. So if you remember that story about me in the roller skating rink, right, I never really finished. So there I was in the Polaroid. I'm standing next to my mom, we're looking at this photo, and I'm on the shoulders of this young man. Remember the story? I don't like strangers, right? Remember? I would have probably bitten people if they tried to grab me, or I just did not like strangers. But here I was on the shoulders of this young man in the roller skating rink. And so I turned to my mom and I'm like, "Mom, what on earth is going on here? I don't recognize this guy. Who is this guy?" And she said, "Oh yeah, let me tell you about that story. It's really great." What happened was our church went to the roller skating rink together as a church. And this young man, he was in high school, about, senior or something, and he came up to me, and you were sitting beside the rink. He came up to me and said, "Do you think Daisy would like to go for a skate around the rink?" And my mom looked at me, and I'm sure I was deer in headlights because he was a stranger. But there was something about it that made me want to say yes. So I said yes. And he put me on his shoulders. And so the photo was of, I was in motion because he was skating, right? So you can picture, remember I said I hardly had any hair. I was one of those girls that the mom always puts the headbands on or somehow tries to attach something to her head that shows she's a girl. And because people would always come, oh, what's your son's name? Because I was bald, And so she always put me in girly colors. So anyway, I had like 7 hairs, and they were really, really, at this time, in the photo, you can tell I only have like 7 hairs. And my hair is white, because when I was young, it was really, really light colored. And so here these 7 hairs are blowing in the wind. I'm on this guy's shoulders, and there is this smile that is spread across my face that looks like I'm on the top of the world. I mean, this is like a defining moment for me as a child. You can tell that I'm just the happiest person. I'm sure I would have told you, oh, I've never been so happy. I've never had so much joy. And had I not trusted that young man, even though he was a stranger, I never would have had that joy-filled ride. It was a risk, but it was worth it. And that was a stranger. So let's turn and think of God. God made us, and he redeemed us. Remember the whole redeeming conversation? He bought us back. And he looks after us. He promises to never leave us. So why wouldn't we trust him? I mean, a stranger is one thing, but the God who made you and loves you and cares about you, why wouldn't we trust him? And yet it's difficult for us to do that, especially when we're in a place of grief or sorrow like Naomi was. I won't deny it. It would have been easier to sit alongside the skating rink, even in our relationship with God. It would be easier to sit aside and watch other people skate, watch other people take chances, watch other people trust God's goodness. And we just sort of keep to ourselves. But when we are willing to take that chance and to trust in his goodness and kindness, even when we don't see it or feel it, we have the opportunity to find freedom and joy in that decision that we have never known before. When we are willing to get on his shoulders and give to him our insecurities and our fears and our sorrows, much like Naomi had, then we're going to see what he can do. And trust me, there is nothing he can't do. And that's what Naomi learned. She never even understood the kind of honor and joy that God was giving her, because she didn't live long enough to see it. First of all, she didn't live long enough to see that her great-great-great-grandson was the king of Israel, the most famous king and the most godly king. She didn't see that. She also didn't see that years down the road, her family was in the line of the Messiah, the God who became man to save the entire world. When I started this study, I started reading all these books and every commentary I could get my hands on, and I started outlining the passages, and I started putting that narrative analysis over the story and started praying about it and asking God to teach me things. I realized that I had actually recently said some things that were similar to what Naomi said about God. For me, it's singleness. I'm single and I would like to be married, but I'm not. And I can actually picture myself in the situation where I've said things like, say someone at work or something would come up to me and say, well, how can you not be married? You're just so cute, and whatever it is they say. And I'm like, well, you're gonna have to talk to God about that, because I'm doing everything I can, and it's still not happening. Okay, I mean, what else can I do? And I've said things like that. I've said things like, well, that's God's problem. Because I can only do so much, or, well, God obviously wants to keep me single because he hasn't provided anyone for me. And those are almost exactly the same words as, I want to be full, but God is keeping me empty, which is exactly what Naomi said. And I was so surprised by that. I didn't realize that those were the kinds of things that I thought about God. Now, I wasn't changing my name from like Daisy to Thistle or something. I hadn't told everyone at my workplace, okay, stop calling me Daisy. I want Poison Oak or Thistle. Those are my only, no. I hadn't done that, but still, my heart was full of doubting God's kindness to me. And for me, that is a place of sorrow. I want something to be the case, and I don't have it, and I see that others do. And I'm like, well, what about me? I mean, come on. Everybody else can get married. At college, trust me, if you're single and you want to be married, college is not the place to work. because these youngsters, they come on up from, freshmen, they start finding mates and they start getting married like crazy, and I'm still alone. I'm still single. And it can be a place of sorrow. But what I realized is that my place of sorrow is my opportunity. I'm sorry if I get a little emotional, but I can trust God before I see him work. I can make that choice. Long before my husband, ends up over here, the prince or whatever that I find, if I ever find one, or if one is ever given to me, I can trust God before that, before I see him provide, before I see him work. Naomi saw him work and she trusted him. But our challenge is, can we trust him before that moment? Will we believe in his goodness? And I have to realize that I may never get what I want. I may never marry. I may never have a husband. I may never have a family of that sort, although these two girls here are like a family to me. But that doesn't change the truth. The truth is the truth, no matter how I feel about my circumstance. And the truth is that our God is not against us. He has not afflicted his people. That's just not who he is. He's a good and he's a kind God. And I believe the story of Naomi. And like I said earlier, or Ruth, for those of you that voted the other way, I believe the story, and like I said earlier, it's one of a kind, right? Because it's historical. There are certain players that it could never happen again. However, it's your story and it's my story, because we can make choices to trust the goodness of God, and we can find joy and fulfillment in the moment of heartache. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait until we receive what we want. We can choose it now. And one doesn't have to understand the circumstance in order to trust the God that governs it. We too can find joy right in the middle of our heartache, and a legacy that long outlasts our lives if we are willing to give up our bitterness and trust him. Will you trust him with me? Let's pray together. Dear Lord, we thank you for today, this glorious sunshine, all the good things that you give us, all the good gifts. We praise you for them, and we ask you for one more, at least in the next 10 minutes, that you would give us the grace to trust you. Even if we are in the midst of sorrow, if we are in the midst of disappointment, whatever we're in, Lord, I pray that you will help us learn to trust you. You are a good God. And I pray for these women here today that you will remind them over this week and over the next couple months that you are trustworthy and that they can trust you even when things don't seem to be going their way. And I pray that people who see them from outside the church and in the community, that they will see something different about this group of women that trust God no matter what. I pray that you will make us like Ruth and make us like the faithful characters in the story of Naomi, and that we would continue to be faithful to you, and that our lives would have a legacy that would outlast us. And we thank you, Lord, for making us a part of this salvation story, making us followers of Christ, your Messiah, that changed the world and gave us hope. I pray that we would be good representatives of him, and that we would continue to trust you. We love you, Lord.
The Lord has promised good to me. His word, my hope secure. He will my share and portion me as long as life endures. My